Hey everyone, Anark here, and this is another installment of Anark Abridged. Today's topic is going to be what is actually damaging the ecology. And I know that this is probably kind of a provocative title for some people. It seems pretty obvious to the majority of human beings at this point that what's causing climate change is carbon emissions. And that's true. You know, that's certainly not something I intend to deny in this video. But I think it's a little overly simplistic to boil it down to that alone. And that's not to say, of course, that I don't think that global warming is being caused by carbon emissions, as much is obviously proven by all existing scientific data. But the point I'm trying to get across here is that there's a lot more at play than just the emission of these greenhouse gases. I think that it's good for the public to recognize that the emission of greenhouse gases is causing the heat of the planet to increase. That is to say that the albedo of the planet is changing. The icebergs are melting, which is to say that more ocean area is being exposed, which is creating more reflection of sunlight, but the greenhouse gases are trapping the sunlight in the atmosphere, and so on and so on. All of that is absolutely true. But that is not the only problem that we are being faced with. So there are a lot of different issues at hand. We are seeing significant ecosystem collapses, which is to say we are seeing entire, chains of predation and prey and symbiosis and everything in between. We're watching them collapse. Part of that is because we are losing key species. We are losing what are called keystone species. These keystone species are actually... Sorry, somebody's joining us today. He's moving around in my lap a lot. But we are losing a lot of these keystone species. A keystone species is one that, if they are lost, the entire chain sort of breaks down. And you might be surprised to find that those keystone species aren't always what you would expect. Sometimes they are plants. Sometimes they are mundane prey animals and so on. But what we're finding is that more and more of these species are dying off. And it is absolutely the case that this is partially because their ecosystems are collapsing by way of a rapidly changing climate. The either presence of too much heat or not enough heat, of drought and extreme rainfall and so on. That's absolutely the case. But there are a bunch of other factors. For example, just pollution. The amount of plastics and toxic chemicals which we are dumping into our rivers, into all of our water sources, are causing enormous problems. They're ending up in our water tables. And once that's in your water table, it's very difficult for that to recover. That takes a long time for that to recover. And these toxic chemicals are even going out to the ocean. We're seeing enormous amounts of waste and trash being discarded. And we end up with these things like the Trans-Pacific garbage patch, or I believe that's what it's called, but it's a massive garbage patch out in the middle of the ocean. It's the size of like a state. It's huge. But there are all these things I could note. Right? There's lots of specifics that could be given. I wanted to start by kind of broadening out our recognition of the crisis at hand, because when it's broadened out in this fashion, it becomes a little more obvious that we can't, for example, just stop fossil fuels and everything will be fixed, right? It's more than just fossil fuels. And I do not want to discourage anybody from fighting on that front to cease our use or at least the extensive use of fossil fuels, especially as a fuel. A lot of petroleum could be used for much more useful processes than as a fuel for combustion. And I want to make sure that everybody, still understands the importance of transitioning to new sources of energy. That's of course, very important. But all the problems understood together, you start to understand that this is a systemic problem, that we are not simply going to solve this problem of climate change and eco disaster that is taking place simply by, doing enough solar energy or doing enough nuclear energy. That's not going to solve the problem at its base. So I think a lot of people are probably familiar with the critique that this is due to capitalism. And I don't want to deny such a thing. I think that this is getting closer to the problem. We'll kind of lay that out a little bit. Why is the critique that capitalism is the problem? Why is capitalism at the root of this ecological disaster? Well, because capitalism only understands accumulation of profit, right? That is its central dictum. It's often been said that, capitalism functions under the logic of a cancer: expand, 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 expand forever with no conception of its own limits. Every firm seeks to expand forever. It can never conceive of a time when it will have gotten enough profit, enough power in the economy, and then it can stop. In capitalism, that's not a thing. It wants infinite growth. And the ecology is not built for infinite growth. The ecology is deeply intertwined. It is based in the existence of different kinds of materials and in certain amounts and certain concentrations, such that certain species can survive for long periods of time in harmonious relation with one another, or not harmonious as it may be, and go through long periods of equilibrium as these ecological factors balance with one another. However, this concept of infinite growth sort of throws all of that to the wind, doesn't it? It conceptualizes that limits don't exist, just like the cancer, right? It seeks to consume more and more and more and more at every single turn. So it's understandable, it's logical how people could then arrive upon the conclusion that the problem is capitalism. But I want to contend, and I think this is kind of the point of this video, that is, although a very big problem, and most certainly indicative of the problem itself, it is not the problem that is causing the issue. Here we sort of arrive at the thesis of social ecology. That is to say, the real problem is that we have a hierarchical society. Hierarchical power structures fundamentally function like capitalism has just been described. That is not unique to capitalism. This logic of the cancer, this desire to expand infinitely, to never stop expanding, to always accumulate more and more, that is not uniquely the logic of capitalism. That is the logic of all hierarchical power structures. The hierarchical power structure seeks to accumulate power into the top of the structure. And in doing so, the top of that structure acts as a sort of catalyst for eternal accumulation. And that is to say, the top of a hierarchical power structure can never conceive limits. It can only conceive how everything underneath it can be instrumentalized to its will and toward its end of accumulation. And perhaps this sounds too abstract, so let's ground it once again. Before the time of capitalism, it's not as if accumulation and ecological damage were like never a problem beforehand. In fact, it's sometimes been said that the beginning of our modern climate change crisis and the behaviors, these sort of structural behaviors which led to the issues that we see now, began back in the feudal era. And that was with the extreme cultivation and clear cutting of forests. Old empires also, like our empires who seek oil, also sought energy reserves, and those energy reserves were more often lumber. So they wanted more trees. And in fact, this led to, or this wasn't the only factor, but this is one of the significant factors that led to the prevalence of territorial disputes and land wars that took place in the medieval era. You had, it was really important that an empire, or rather just a kingdom, had enough trees, had enough lumber, had enough access to these amenities such that they could provide all of the needs of their kingdom. And those needs were multifaceted, of course. They needed lumber to build buildings, but they also burnt wood in order to make heat. And in order to then make coal, for example, another energy source. And as they did this, climate records show that this was the beginning of extreme release of carbon into the atmosphere, which is now recognized as one of the leading causes of climate change. Carbon as it is, or carbon dioxide being a significant greenhouse gas. So this problem, literally the problem of seeking too much energy resources and then emitting too much greenhouse gases from your energy sources goes back pretty much as far back as hierarchy goes. Hierarchical power just did it with lumber beforehand. The thing is that those hierarchical power structures just weren't powerful enough to consume enough lumber to cause this same problem. And I suspect that probably trees and burning wood was not enough to cause the emissions at scale of burning petroleum. However, I'm not trying to say that, this was an equivalent problem. I'm trying to get across the point that this problem does not root to, just our consumption of fossil fuels, nor does it just root to capitalism. It roots to the need for hierarchical power to always accumulate more. And that's just one aspect of it. Because hierarchical power structures don't only want to accumulate more. They don't want to only accumulate forever with no conception of limits. They also have to simplify everything to fit within their schemas. So this leads us to the next very important point. And that is, when you see everything from the top of a hierarchical power structure, you see too much information for you to consume at any given time. And the narrower the top of that power structure, the more that is the case. I mean, just, in a practical sense, just start with the human element. Any one person cannot know everything that is happening at any given time, right? That's impossible. They just cannot, there's no way their brains can intake that information. So what do? They look for collations of the data. They look for places where the data has been turned into graphs and tables and it's been statistically analyzed and so on. These are mechanisms through which we take extremely complex data sets and we simplify them such that we can understand them. Well, if you have millions of people taking place in that process, you might be able to process an enormous amount of complex information about a bunch of different kinds of areas. However, the more that power is concentrated, the smaller the bandwidth is for receiving that information, because the fewer people are available to actually input and decide on how that information should be used. If you only have 5 people who are trying to interpret this massive data set, they're going to necessarily reduce the complexity of that data set more than if you had 500,000. And this is because 500,000 people, that's more bandwidth to interpret data, to intake that data, and then to fit it into frameworks such that decisions can be made, and as well to process the decisions that need to be made. So you may be saying to yourself, okay, well, yes, that's true, but that's kind of just one of these fundamental limitations of human beings. And I would agree with you. It is a fundamental limitation of human beings, but it's a fundamental limitation that is made worse with hierarchical power structures. Because hierarchical power structures don't just stop there. They understand implicitly what I am saying. That's why that they, of course, create massive databases of information. This is why that they get this information put into graphs and tables and so on and so on. They have people whose jobs it is to reduce this information to understandable bite-sized chunks and then to deliver it to them so that they can supposedly make better decisions. However, even though there are many occasions wherein this behavior, this simplifying behavior will work and it will be fine, much of the time what's happening is that you are reducing complex systems which cannot be properly reduced. So complex systems are systems wherein your statistical averages and your tables of data are really not going to tell you how to interact with that system. However, the problem is the hierarchical power structure is then going to act upon that simplified data. It is going to make decisions. It is going to pass legislation. It is going to interact and act in the world in such a way that it applies the data, that the information from from what it is gathered, and apply it back onto the world. And in doing so, it attempts to simplify the world reciprocally. So that is the biggest problem. Okay, the intake, the information problem, you might say. That's one aspect. That is a problem. I won't pretend that that's not an issue in itself, but it's not the biggest part of the problem. The biggest part of the problem is then that they take that simplified information and they act on the world to make the world match the schema to match that simplified schema. It is the attempt to turn the very complex world into kind of a map. They've developed a map, and then they want to turn the world into their map. Okay, so maybe this still doesn't quite make sense. Let me give an example. Okay, let's say for example, there is we have like Google Maps, right? And Google Maps has like a very complete understanding of the road system, right? But it doesn't have an absolutely complete understanding of the road system, as I'm sure many people have found themselves when using a GPS. Not only does it sometimes make mistakes, which is one thing, but it also just doesn't have every single little road and alley and street that could exist in the map. So that is to say, the map reduces complexity in the process. As far as streets and roads go, that's not a problem. But when it comes to an ecosystem, that's an enormous problem, because ecosystems don't care about our maps. When you put roads in the wrong place, people will still follow the roads, and it will perhaps make our lives more miserable that you chose a bad place for the road, which is a topic more about urban planning. But humans can adapt their behaviors and their societies to match the new road system that you have imposed. Ecosystems can adapt, but as you try to impose these simplified schemas onto the ecosystem, you sort of trap the ecosystem within a box that it can't function within. The ecosystem needs flexibility. It needs to be able to change. It needs to be able to shift and move and make adjustments as per its internal measures. And if we impose these simplifications on the ecosystem is going to run up against these walls as it seeks to adapt, and it is going to be worse at adapting. It is going to, whereas perhaps creatures could have used normal mechanisms, such as, moving from one area to another, or a predator, its population getting larger as is needed to consume a prey species, or any number of these sort of natural ecological fixes, as humanity places constraints and interacts more simplistically with this ecosystem, the more that ecosystem is constrained to arbitrary human simplifications. And this is at the center of the problem. This cycle I'm discussing here, this cycle of trying to simplify complex systems down to a place where they can be understood as data, and then that data being taken and then acting back upon the world with more simplification schemas. That is disastrous for ecologies. That is something for which, if we were to stop emitting greenhouse gases, let's say we moved into some form of renewable energy, and we didn't fix that problem, then we would still be a fundamentally ecocidal culture. Because that process that I just described there, as well as others that take place, for example, like the pillaging of the environment and just, more overt examples of violence against the environment, like the continuation of clear cutting of massive forests, for example. But this process that I'm describing here, this process which is fundamental to hierarchical power structures, to concentrated power structures, that will go on without any breaks if all we do is say switch to solar energy or switch to nuclear energy. Those things will improve the emission of greenhouse gases, but they will not stop this ecocidal behavior which is inherent to hierarchical power structures. And so this is what I meant when I said this is basically the social ecological critique. And let me explain what I mean by that. Social ecology is a system of thought that was developed by Murray Bookchin and a few others. And the fundamental precept of social ecology is that the domination of humanity over nature originates in the domination of humans over one another. So this is a simplification of the idea, but said otherwise, ecological problems are social problems. And this is not a pleasantry. This is to say that the ecological crisis we are facing it roots to the way we have structured our society in that fundamentally hierarchical way that I just described. So, what does that mean? Well, it means our only way out is the deconstruction of hierarchical power structures. It means that our only alternative is to create a horizontalized society. And, this may sound arbitrary. You're saying, oh, Daniel, well, you're an anarchist. Of course you think that. But I just want to indicate this is not just a political theoretic preference of mine. This is backed up by everything we just said. Let's backtrack just a little bit. Back to that information problem. Okay, we got this problem where, information is being bottlenecked. Right? And the more severely it's bottlenecked, the more that the environment is simplified in a reductive way that doesn't take into account its complexities. And what did we say? You solve that problem by having larger number of people process that information and then process the necessary decisions that need to be made. And what is the complexity that's being taken out? It's locality. It's the complexity of locality, of circumstance. There are always going to be universals at play. It's not bad to try to find universals and reason on them. It's that if you only reason on these universals and you try to force the world into your universals, then you are going to reduce all of those, you are going to destroy all of those places where locality and subjectivity and contingency really make the difference between that part of the system standing up or falling down. And the only way you achieve that is by devolving power back down into the masses. The masses themselves must become the processors of information and the deciders about how things will be done in the world with the information that they have received in mass. Because that is the only way that we can return power back to a mode of existence where we can deal with locality and we can deal with subjectivity and we can deal with nuance and complexity. That is where that complexity lies. Complexity lies at that horizontal, construction. It lies in pieces, a bunch of small pieces with a series of very simple behaviors that are added up bigger and bigger and bigger into larger and larger scales until they agglomerate into complexity. So I think for this video, that's probably a good place for us to stop. But if you're interested in me exploring more about this topic, I actually talk about this in my videos, A Modern Anarchism, Part 1 and Part 2, especially Part 2. So if you're on Part 1 and you're wondering when I'm going to talk about this stuff, stay tuned, because Part 2, I will talk about complex systems analysis and complexity in considerable depth. So I'd like to recommend you go watch those videos if you're interested in this topic and you'd like to learn more about the arguments that I'm making here. In any occasion, I think that's enough for our video today. I hope that was some food for thought, that taught you to look at the ecological crisis in a slightly different way. But anyway, if you liked the video, go click like. And if you're interested in more content like this, my whole channel is like this. So click subscribe and you'll see more of my videos in your subscription feed. Also, go comment below, with your thoughts, your ideas, whether you agree or disagree, obviously. Lastly, if you appreciate the work that I'm doing here, I want to compel you to go become a patron at my Patreon. My Patreon is patreon.com/Anark, ANARK, which will, of course, be down in the description. But I think that's about it. I will do one more video on the topic of the ecology next time. And it'll be a little more on this last bit where I ended, which is what can be done. So I hope that you'll join me for the next Anark Abridged. In the meantime, have a good one, and I'll see you next time.